I never thought my son's wedding day would end with a public slap and the death of my place in his life. It was June 14th, 2017. A warm Saturday evening in the Mandarin Grand Ballroom. All white orchids and shimmering lights. 300 guests swirled around linen-draped tables. City council members, venture capitalists, and even the mayor's niece. I had picked the jazz trio myself, covered their deposit weeks earlier. The air smelled like money and borrowed significance. My cheeks still held the faint touch of blush I had applied carefully in my car mirror, right after taping a bandage over the arthritis patch on my left wrist. It happened fast. I had approached the bandstand during a lull, smiling, keeping my voice low. Just wanted to let them know their invoice didn't match what we'd agreed. $4,500 was what they'd quoted. Now it read $6,300 and $1,800 difference. Simple mistake, maybe. Caleb was suddenly there. Blue suit crisp, boutonniere fresh. His jaw was locked tight, eyes scanning the room before narrowing in on me like a security breach. He grabbed my arm, not roughly, but not gently, and hissed through clenched teeth, "Are you trying to embarrass me?" Before I could respond, his hand cracked across my face. The music screeched to a halt. My glasses slipped sideways. My earring fell to the floor with a metallic ping. Gasps fluttered like birds across the ballroom. It was the kind of slap that doesn't just sting your cheek, it stings your memory. I stood there, blinking back tears, feeling the world tilt. My hand found my face. The left side burned, but the pain behind my ribs was worse. Caleb didn't apologize. He turned to the stunned guests and announced, "Excuse her, she's had a long day," then laughed as if it were a family joke. His new wife, Simone, didn't even look my way. She laughed, too. No one moved to help, not even the band. I collected my earring from the floor, straightened my blouse, and walked back to my table, alone, behind a centerpiece of white lilies and shame. I realized, in that moment, I was no longer Caleb's mother in public. I was his liability. I sat alone at that wedding table long after the dessert forks had been cleared, not touching the untouched creme brulee before me. But my mind was 8 years behind, in my avocado green kitchen back on Glenwood Road in Decatur. That kitchen, with its warped cabinet doors and linoleum patchwork, hadn't changed since 1974, and neither, I thought then, had I. I was 62, newly retired after 32 years at Georgia Power as a systems analyst, and I still measured time by savings bonds, coupon booklets, and how many cans of sweet peas were in the pantry. That summer, I had the rhythm of a woman who had kept everything together with routines. Early mornings with gospel radio, midday walks to South DeKalb Mall for catfish or a pretzel, and long evenings balancing checkbooks and watching reruns on a dusty Magnavox. I was never late with bills, never missed a dental appointment. I had weathered a quiet divorce and Caleb's distance with equal silence. He was still speaking to me then, kindly, if impersonally. "Mom, don't stress," he'd say when I offered to help with his rent or student loans. He'd stopped taking money by then, which I mistook for independence. What I didn't know was that he'd also stopped speaking my name in certain rooms. I was his father's widow in casual mentions at work. A soft lie, he once said, helped avoid explaining too much. I asked questions, but not too many. I was trying not to be what he called over-involved. Back then, I'd save up for months to fly to San Francisco or D.C., wherever his tech contracts had taken him. I'd sit on the plane with Tupperware of homemade pecan cookies and a folder of coupons for Bed Bath & Beyond, things I thought said love. I was his mother, but only in private. And slowly, year by year, meal by texted cancellation, that role dissolved into memory. It didn't feel like being cut off, it felt like being blurred out. The ghosting didn't arrive with a door slam. It came on soft soles with polite phrases and delayed callbacks. I thought we were close, but I was already vanishing. By the time Caleb got engaged to Simone, I already understood that our relationship had become something to be managed, not cherished. The clues had been there. His careful tone when friends were around, the subtle corrections about what part of town I lived in, even the way he spoke my name as if it were an embarrassing detail. I didn't know then that he had told his colleagues I was his late father's widow from a previous marriage, a tidy fiction that aged me out of his story and erased the part of him that came from me. When I learned that later, it explained everything: the hesitation in his introductions, the sudden change of subject whenever someone mentioned family. Simone came from a world that believed taste was a form of moral superiority. Her parents lived in Ansley Park and spoke in the clipped, effortless tones of people who had never worried about mortgage renewals. The first time I met them, I wore a navy pantsuit I'd bought at Dillard's and carried a modest bouquet of lilies. Simone's mother accepted them with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, how thoughtful," she said, the way someone might comment on a child's finger painting. At the engagement dinner, I arrived early, hoping to help. The restaurant was all chrome and candlelight, a Buckhead rooftop venue where the parking valet looked startled when I asked for validation instead of tipping from a cash clip. Caleb greeted me with the brisk efficiency of a maître d', guiding me to a seat near the service hallway. "Mom, just stay in the back for this part," he whispered. "There's a certain flow we're going for." I smiled, though my chest burned. The waiter passed with trays of seared tuna and truffle crostini. My son's laughter carried across the room, practiced and polished for the right audience. The night before the wedding, I got an automated email from the planner with an updated seating chart. My name had been moved. Row G, table 12, tucked behind a pillar near the kitchen doors. That was the moment I knew I wasn't just being sidelined. I was being erased for aesthetics. His image couldn't afford the texture of me. The sting on my cheek faded by morning, but the imprint of the slap lingered in quieter ways. How the world didn't flinch, how no one followed up. No text, no call, not even a hollow apology wrapped in excuses. Instead, what arrived 5 days later was a Venmo request from Simone's cousin Ivy for a broken champagne flute. "Hi! So sorry, but this was from the reception. You knocked it over when you left early. Hope you understand." 2 hearts? The emoji felt surgical. The charge was for $48. I stared at it for a full minute, heart slowing to a crawl. It wasn't just about a glass. It was a message. You're not just excluded, you're accountable. I paid it. Then, without ceremony, I printed a transaction summary from our last shared Bank of America account, the one I'd opened years ago to transfer emergency funds during Caleb's grad school years. I'd kept it open out of habit, still listed as a cosigner even after he'd stopped acknowledging my birthdays. When I stepped into the branch on Candler Road, the air smelled like stale printer toner and pine disinfectant. Ms. Lorraine, the bank manager, raised her eyebrows when she saw me approach. "Ms. Nellis," she said, "you okay?" I was holding a folder I had labeled Finals. Inside were closing forms, past statements, even the check stub from the $500 I'd once sent for his dental work. "Just here to tie off a few loose ends," I told her. "The shared account with Caleb, I'd like it closed, please." She blinked, then nodded slowly. "Understood." There was a delay because Caleb had moved some automatic withdrawals to that account without telling me, some startup subscriptions, recurring software services under vague names like Hive Consult and VentureSync. I authorized the cancellations one by one, initials steady beside each signature box. I walked out of that branch without looking back. On the drive home, I passed the church where I used to teach Sunday computer skills, and I realized I hadn't spoken to anyone all week. Not even Miss Dottie from Bible study. I didn't feel lonely. I felt like a woman finally subtracting herself from the balance sheet of someone else's ambition. 3 months after I closed the account, I sat across from a man who shook my hand like I was someone with purpose. Mr. Darnell Ellis, CPA, had been recommended by a retired friend from my church sewing group, Sister Maureen, who described him as the kind of brother who knows how to keep business both clean and quiet. His office was tucked inside a modest Buckhead suite above a dentist and a divorce mediator, paneled in walnut and smelling faintly of lemon polish and printer ink. I hadn't told anyone where I was going that morning. I wore navy slacks, a charcoal cardigan, and my wedding set, though I'd been divorced for years. I needed to feel anchored in something while I dismantled everything else. Mr. Ellis took his time, no rush in his tone, letting me unpack the folder labeled Next Life. Inside were statements from Navy Federal, the closing paperwork on my brother Alan's old duplex off Memorial Drive, and the remainder of my 401k, whittled down but intact, thanks to a habit of hoarding modestly and spending less. He studied the papers in silence, eyes scanning as though they could smell weakness in the ink. When he finally looked up, his voice was low and free of flattery. "Ms. Nellis, you've got options. What you don't need is noise. Or sentimentality." He tapped a line on the CD paperwork. "This rolls over in 62 days. That gives us a window to move." He explained it all carefully, never talking down to me. A 3-entity structure. A single-member LLC, registered in Delaware, layered under a Georgia domestic holding company, bearing my maiden name, Turner Legacy Partners. He even asked if I wanted to use initials to make it more anonymous. "No," I said. "Let it carry my name. I've been invisible long enough." Over the course of 3 meetings and a dozen signatures, I transferred every hard-earned cent into something that no one could link back to a mother they didn't claim. Darnell didn't ask why I was doing it. He just made sure it was done right. When I walked out, I wasn't richer. I was protected. And for the first time, I was the only one holding the keys. Nearly 2 years passed before I heard my son's name spoken in a tone that didn't carry heat or shame. It came through my old Comcast inbox, a relic I kept only because it was tied to utility logins and the rare church bulletin. The subject line read, "Investor arrival confirmed for conference room B," and the sender was someone I didn't recognize, m.morris@juniperhive.com. I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, until I saw the attachment, APDF. Inside that file, buried in the standard meeting logistics and catering options, was a list of capital sources scheduled for a, quote, preliminary roundtable. One line stopped me cold. TLP Holdings, confirmed for Q4 funding. $1.2 million preliminary approval. DC affiliate arrival, TBD, TLP. Turner Legacy Partners, my company. I stared at the screen, breath caught between memory and confusion. The name wasn't just close, it was exact. I'd never shared it with Caleb, never mentioned a word about reinvestments. But there it was, casually listed under stakeholders, as if I had been sitting at the table all along. The name had no face to them, just a shell they thought belonged to someone else. The moment clarified like sunlight hitting dust. He hadn't just distanced himself from me, he had unknowingly built his business on my legacy. My careful, quiet maneuvers had become the foundation of his latest identity. A fintech darling with Ivy League polish and Southern pitch. It made my stomach tighten, not out of pride, but out of the ugly symmetry of it. The same man who moved me behind a pillar had been crowing about family-backed resilience in pitch decks sent to strangers. He'd leveraged bloodline when it was convenient, ancestry when it sounded like capital. And now, through some administrative oversight or carelessness, I'd been looped into the very circle he had worked so hard to exclude me from. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I sat in my kitchen, the same green cabinets blinking under the afternoon sun, and whispered to no one in particular, "He's been using my name all along." Then I opened a fresh notepad, wrote down the file number, and underlined the dollar figure twice. $1.2 million. My silence had earned them a stage. Now it would buy me a seat. I didn't confront Caleb. Not then. Not with rage or pleading or the kind of questions that only expose how much you still hope to be seen. I knew better. Instead, I opened my notebook, underlined the phrase DC affiliate arrival TBD, and started mapping out a strategy. Not revenge. This wasn't a movie. What I wanted was clarity, something irrefutable and clean. Something that, when laid on the table, would strip every layer of polish from his curated version of family. I reached out to the one person I trusted to navigate shadows without leaving fingerprint, Tasha McMillian. 27, sharp-eyed, and born to a mother I used to carpool with from Bible study, Tasha had just passed her paralegal certification and spent her evenings tutoring GED candidates at the community center. She didn't flinch when I laid the details out, just pulled her locks into a bun and said, "We start with the SEC. Everything leaves a trail if you know where to look." We used the filing number embedded in the PDF to trace the fund source. 3 late nights and 1 coffee-stained spreadsheet later, we had it. Juniper Hive's Series A documentation registered under Ellis and Ridgway Legal, LLC. A buried appendix listed all ownership stakes. There it was again. TLP Holdings, 61.4%, listed as a silent equity majority, filed with an address linked to the same UPS store box I'd used for privacy. Caleb had no idea, and because he didn't know who held the majority, he hadn't sought consent. We found internal emails through a small breach. Tasha knew someone at a compliance firm who owed her a favor. One string showed his assistant confirming a delayed onboarding of external partner due to anonymity clause. Another read, "Assume no pushback. She doesn't know she's on the cap table." She. Not a name. Not even a title. Just a faceless figure behind a fund he thought he'd buried in bureaucracy. That night, Tasha printed everything. Emails, filing indexes, even the chain of registered agents. We laid it out across my dining room table, receipts from a son who once asked me not to wear loud colors around his coworkers. I didn't know exactly what I was building yet, but I knew this. Someday, he'd learn who she was. The first time I heard Caleb's voice again, it came filtered through a Zoom call, his face framed by faux exposed brick and artfully placed succulents. I had scheduled the meeting using a Gmail account tied to the holding company, posing as G. Turner, a liaison for the DC-based investor. I expected a brush-off, maybe a low-level associate. Instead, Caleb appeared himself, shirt crisp, teeth bright, confidence practically steaming through the screen. He didn't recognize me. Not even in the voice, not in the polite southern cadence I'd returned to for the call. Maybe I'd changed more than I realized, or maybe he never really listened closely enough to know me in the first place. He launched into his pitch with the kind of ease I used to hear when he was a boy, selling coupon books door-to-door for school fundraisers. Juniper Hive is building the infrastructure for Black generational wealth, smart contracts, passive portfolios, legacy-built assets, he said, gesturing with well-trained hands. We're closing with Belmont Ventures next quarter. The plan is to go wide at the Atlanta Angel Network Gala, strictly private, invite only. I made a humming sound, like I was taking notes. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. He filled every silence with boasts. His wife's name came up once. Simone was managing our interior brand extension, which sounded like she was picking furniture again and calling it strategy. When he leaned back in his chair to sip his coffee, I noticed his watch. A Patek Philippe, subtle, probably borrowed or financed, but expensive enough to demand credibility. He didn't ask my name. Not once. Just ended the call with, "We're excited to have you on board. Tell your DC principal we'll make them proud." When the screen went dark, I stared at my reflection in the monitor for a long time. A woman twice erased, once from a wedding, now from a deal built on the bones of her labor. But this time, I wasn't blinking back tears. I was strategizing. There was no fury, no breakdown. Just the heavy calm of someone waiting for a train she'd already mapped the route of. He didn't know it yet, but I'd already boarded. Tasha found the next crack through a late-night scroll and a paralegal's instinct for pattern. She was combing through social media, not the polished LinkedIn profiles or company bios, but the curated chaos of Instagram stories. One clip, posted months earlier and almost buried in Simone's archive, showed the two of them in a rooftop lounge, glasses raised, the city skyline blurred behind them. Caleb was mid-laugh, flushed with champagne and victory. Simone's caption scrawled over the image like a crown of thorns. "We DID that, without old deadweight nail polish medium skin tone." I read it once, then again, Not because I didn't understand, but because I needed to feel the shape of the words on my tongue. Old dead weight. No initials, no context. Just cruelty disguised as cheek. Tasha didn't say anything at first. She just passed me the screenshot like a nurse delivering a prognosis. Professional, soft, but certain. Then she slid another document across the table, a pitch deck dated December 2022. Inside, on slide 6, was a line that read, "Seed capital provided via legacy wealth, maternal family investors, discrete fund stream." The math matched. The narrative didn't. My name, scrubbed. My life, sanitized into a tidy abstraction of legacy. They had taken my years of scrimping, of navigating student loan co-signatures and grocery sales, and rebranded it as generational mystique. It wasn't enough to erase me. They had turned me into fiction. I felt something settle in me then. Not bitterness, not rage, but the final click of clarity. They weren't just ashamed of who I was. They were using the shadow of who I used to be to stage their ascent. And they were doing it so casually, so publicly, that it had become part of their shared language. I pulled out a legal pad, drew a box around the date of the pitch deck, and wrote, "Timeline of strategic erasure." Then I added the Instagram story beneath it. No one would say those words if they hadn't already rehearsed them in safer rooms. It meant the story had traction. It meant they believed they were already free of me. But the thing about dead weight, when you cut it loose, sometimes it grows wings. It was Tasha who spotted it first, the signature. We were reviewing the Belmont Ventures legal file, which she had pulled using a pro bono login from her old internship. It was buried near the back of the supplemental agreement, a section marked, quote, "Founder consent and guarantee," the kind of boilerplate language designed to lull the eye. But there, under a block of legalese and time-stamped metadata, was my name, Gwendolyn Turner Nellis, signed in digital ink, except I had never signed it. The handwriting was unmistakable, too clean, too symmetrical. I knew my own scrawl, crooked from years of notepads and utility checks. This one was lifted. A perfect copy of the signature on my 2011 Georgia DMV renewal form, the one I remembered because the pen had skipped halfway through the T. Tasha pulled up the records side by side, circling the skip, the stroke angle, the telltale curl of the lowercase e. It had been lifted, likely digitized, and inserted through a third-party notary platform that didn't require facial ID or live verification. The platform, Juniper Hive's preferred vendor, had been flagged in a class action suit the previous year for negligent verification. The file creation date? October 16, 2023, the same week Caleb and Simone had posted glossy photos from their Bora Bora honeymoon. I remembered because it had popped up on my phone while I was watching a rerun of Murder, She Wrote, and I'd paused the episode out of some reflexive, foolish hope. They were drinking coconut cocktails in floating villas while he used my forged consent to secure another round of funding. My stomach turned, not from shock anymore, but from the cold math of it. Caleb hadn't just erased me, he had forged me into compliance, used my name when it was useful, silenced me when it wasn't, and trusted that the systems around him would never bother to ask if the woman on the documents was still breathing. I printed the affidavit, marked it with a red paperclip, and slid it into a growing folder labeled Validation. This was no longer a trail of oversight. It was theft, and now it was provable. By early February 2025, the architecture of Caleb's deceit had grown into something gleaming, polished, and dangerously inflated. Juniper Hive was now listed as one of Atlanta's startups to watch, in a tech digest I used to read in waiting rooms. He was photographed at a panel next to a senator's nephew, captioned with a quote about rooting innovation in ancestral accountability. I stared at that word, ancestral, until it lost meaning, became a hollow sound. Behind the scenes, he had leveraged my silent majority stake to secure a $2.7 million line of credit. Belmont's capital had cleared, and he was moving fast. The startup's main office had relocated to a glossy suite downtown with matte black doors and a reception desk made of reclaimed Georgia pine. He'd bought a Porsche Taycan Turbo S base price $400,000, according to the invoice Tasha pulled from a vendor subfile, and Simone had posted an unboxing video of custom luggage embossed with their shared initials. Their life was now curated for perception. Espresso meetings, charity brunches, pre-gala fittings. The lie had matured into an ecosystem. But the deeper I looked, the more I saw just how tightly he'd woven the falsehood into his public identity. His new investor brief listed foundational funding from a Virginia-based family trust and a biography that described multiple generations of financial stewardship rooted in quiet legacy. The legacy was mine. The quiet was intentional. He had learned how to exploit silence the way some men exploit oil, extracted, refined, repackaged for resale. What stung wasn't just the theft. It was the performative nobility. He wasn't pretending to be ruthless. He was pretending to be principled. The final crack came while watching a live stream of the Atlanta Equity Forum, projected through my laptop onto the same wall where Caleb's middle school graduation photo still hung in a dusty wooden frame. He stood on stage, microphone in hand, smiling like he'd never had a mother. "We're not just building for now," he told the crowd. "We're building for every grandmother who dreamed of equity but never had access." I stared at him and whispered aloud, "I was never the one without access. You were." That night, I stopped mourning and started preparing. I turned 70 on a quiet Sunday. No cards, no calls, no trace of acknowledgement from the son I carried into this world on a humid spring night after 12 hours of labor and a bus ride cut short by contraction. I baked myself a lemon cake, the way my mother used to. Dense, not too sweet, a glaze made from real juice and powdered sugar. I set a single candle in the center, not for wishes, but for proof. Proof that I was still here. I ate one slice in silence and saved the rest in Tupperware. Then I opened my laptop and watched my son speak about grit. There he was, pacing the stage in expensive shoes and borrowed language, selling the myth of struggle as if it had been his burden alone. He said, "Our generation must carry forward the dreams our elders weren't allowed to build." The audience clapped. Somewhere in the background, Simone lifted her phone to record. No mention of the hand that paid his tuition or the roof that stayed stable while his startups failed. No nod to the woman who pawned her wedding ring one December so he wouldn't have to miss rent. I was no longer inconvenient. I was folklore, a silhouette in the origin story, useful only in abstract. And yet something in me shifted that evening, not with anger, but with intention. He had erased me in pursuit of a version of himself that couldn't exist if I stood beside him. I finally understood. I had become incompatible with the fantasy he was selling. He needed legacy without lineage, sacrifice without the mess of gratitude. I was not a mother to him anymore. I was a liability dressed in hand-me-downs. So I lit a candle, finished my cake, and began to draft a timeline. Not a manifesto, not a confession. A record. One that would follow procedure. One that would name things correctly. Forged documents, unauthorized filings, deceptive public claims. No emotional flourishes. No desperate mother letters. By morning, the list had dates, file numbers, and 3 names. Tasha McMillian, Mr. Darnell Ellis, and a private contact at Belmont I hadn't spoken to since her father's funeral. I didn't want revenge. I wanted verification. It was time to speak, not to him, but to the room he'd tried to bar me from. It took 3 weeks of quiet, deliberate work to arrange the kind of meeting that couldn't be talked around. Mr. Ellis handled the investor side documentation, filing the request for a formal equity audit through a private compliance clause built into the original funding language. Language Caleb had likely never read closely, assuming the money would always flow without scrutiny. Tasha reached out to her contact at Belmont Ventures, a junior partner named Rena Holt, who had once attended Spelman with her cousin and now held just enough influence to make things move quickly without triggering alarm. The venue was strategic. We requested the 45th floor boardroom of the Monarch building downtown, the same suite where, coincidentally, The Atlanta Equity Forum would host its invite-only gala the following evening. The room, all glass walls and long walnut table, overlooked the city Caleb now claimed as his canvas. This time, I would be visible, not as a guest, as a principal. Invitations were issued with neutral phrasing. Stakeholder review session, founding entities encouraged to attend. Nothing inflammatory. No hint of conflict. Just the kind of corporate language that makes powerful men show up early, nervous in their cufflinks. Every founding member of Juniper Hive was listed as requested but not required. And because ambition thrives on optics, they all RSVP'd. Yes, I dressed deliberately that morning. A navy silk blazer, slacks that held shape, low kitten heels. I pinned back my hair, dabbed on a hint of coral lipstick, and carried a plain leather folio. There were no pearls, no performative softness. I wasn't there to look maternal. Tasha walked beside me through the lobby, her steps quick, energy focused. She carried the real payload, documents notarized and backed by digital trail, printouts of internal emails, and a USB drive tagged with a small red sticker, verified. Mr. Ellis met us upstairs, already reviewing the projected cap table on his tablet, jaw tight with purpose. As I stepped past the velvet rope at the check-in desk, a young security guard glanced at the list, looked up at me, and squinted. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "you look kind of familiar." He scanned the tablet again, then his face changed. "Oh," he whispered, stepping aside. "You're her." The boardroom was already full when I stepped inside. The lights were low, dimmed to keep attention on the sleek digital display projected across the far wall. Caleb stood near the front with his co-founder, an overgroomed man named Preston, who looked like he'd stepped out of a venture capital casting call. They were wrapping up a demo, something about AI-powered financial literacy tools, and Caleb was in peak performance mode, sleeves rolled to just the right height, voice calibrated for conviction, chin lifted toward the kind of future only he could see. He didn't see me at first. I moved quietly to the side, waited for the slide deck to fade into the Q&A portion. That's when Rena, the Belmont partner Tasha had contacted, cleared her throat. "Before we proceed with additional projections," she said, "we've had a request for a brief statement from a representative of a listed majority entity. If the room agrees, we'll allow 5 minutes." No one objected, because no one yet understood what was coming. I stepped forward and handed the moderator a slim USB stick. "These files contain documentation regarding the formation and funding of TLP Holdings, including notarized signatures, a forged digital affidavit, and internal communications pertaining to knowledge of stake misrepresentation." I spoke calmly, without apology or explanation, just fact. Tasha distributed printed copies of key documents, my name on the founding cap table, time-stamped emails referencing she has no clue who owns what, the DMV signature template lifted without consent. Every line had been cross-referenced, every date substantiated. Caleb's voice came from behind me, sharp, incredulous. "What? What is this?" He sounded younger than he had in years. "And scared." The moderator scrolled through the file on the screen. The signature affidavit appeared next, blinking under a magnifier. Silence followed. No foot taps. No whispered asides. Just the cold, sterile hush of a room being forced to recognize a truth it had been complicit in ignoring. I turned, slowly, and met Caleb's eyes. He didn't speak again. His face was pale, his mouth slightly open, as if words had abandoned him completely. I didn't need him to say anything. The documents were speaking now, and this time, they were telling the whole truth. The Belmont lead investor, a soft-spoken woman in her early 40s named Jaya Kulkarni, adjusted her glasses and reread the affidavit aloud. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. Every word landed with the weight of officialdom, the kind that makes men in custom suits glance at each other and start measuring exits. Caleb's name appeared twice in the forged signature section, once as the requester, once in the confirmation email to the notary vendor. Jaya paused, then looked up. "Mr. Nellis, would you like to respond to the evidence presented?" Caleb tried to recover. He stood, adjusted his collar, and launched into a voice I hadn't heard since he was 13 and caught cheating on a middle school math quiz. I mean, there was never any malice intended, he stammered. My mother, she gave verbal consent. This was just an effort to streamline onboarding. Nothing material was hidden. It's a misunderstanding. But he couldn't look at me. Preston slid his chair back. Just an inch, but enough. A physical retreat. A signal. The other co-founders avoided eye contact, staring instead at their hands or their phones, as if praying for a distraction that wouldn't come. The room had shifted. The narrative had slipped. I didn't speak. Not again. My part was done. Tasha had prepared everything so thoroughly that there was no need for emotion. Only structure. Only consequence. Jaya nodded to a compliance associate, who took notes without lifting his head. Then she said, with crisp neutrality, pending full legal review, we are issuing a temporary freeze on all disbursements from the Series A funding pool. No new investor communications will be released until the equity structure has been verified independently. Any breaches of fiduciary duty will be documented and addressed. Her tone was kind, but final. Caleb sat back down slowly, hands folded like a schoolboy reprimanded in front of the class. I watched his reflection in the glass wall, the profile of a man suddenly unsure who he was, without the story he'd built on someone else's back. That room, once his stage, was no longer a safe space. It had become a court, and for once, I wasn't the one on trial. By the time I got home that evening, the industry blogs had already picked up the story. The headlines were cautious but unmistakable. Founder under review for stake misrepresentation. Juniper Hive faces equity freeze amid audit. A few were more salacious. One tech gossip site called it Mom versus Mogul. I didn't read past the headlines. The facts were already filed in my folder. Stamped, notarized, unarguable. What I hadn't expected was the silence. Not just from Caleb, but from everyone. His LinkedIn profile went dark by morning. The cheerful banner image of his team huddled around laptops vanished, replaced by a default gray. The Instagram page that once glowed with celebratory brunches and rooftop selfies disappeared overnight. Even Simone went quiet, no longer posting curated reels of their ambitious lifestyle. Their orbit collapsed without announcement. It didn't take long. There were no frantic calls, no teary voicemails, no dramatic doorstep apologies. He didn't reach for me, not to beg, not to rage, not even to explain. He simply vanished behind the corporate wall he'd once used to keep me out. I had forced his hand, but I hadn't delivered vengeance. Just proof. The world he'd built on air finally had to stand in gravity. And that, more than anything, made him disappear. Tasha checked in daily at first, updating me on the compliance review, which was now being handled by an outside counsel firm specializing in equity disputes. Mr. Ellis filed the necessary amendments to reassert my ownership formally, not just in paper but in practice. No one contested it. There was nothing left to say. I spent the next few days tending to my small garden, pruning tomato vines and coaxing azaleas back to bloom. I washed my windows for the first time in months. Every motion felt like a reclamation, not of property, but of rhythm. My life, small and undisturbed, had room again. Not for Caleb, but for breath. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I thought a mother's job was to be needed, to stay available, to never outgrow her usefulness. But now I understood the quiet power of detachment, not from love, but from obligation mistaken as love. The freeze remained in place for 3 weeks before the formal findings were issued. The report didn't use sensational language, just the measured terms of institutional rebuke. Misrepresentation of stakeholder consent, breach of fiduciary duty, procedural irregularities in equity allocation. But behind the words was a clear verdict. Juniper Hive had built itself on the concealment of its majority investor, and that investor, me, had never granted approval. The fallout was immediate. Belmont retracted their next installment of funding and referred the matter to their legal advisory panel. Several prospective partners withdrew from pending negotiations, citing instability in leadership structure. No lawsuits were filed, yet, but the specter hovered. In startup circles, perception often precedes process. The stain had already set. Preston, who had once introduced Caleb as the cultural engine behind our mission, resigned via a 2-sentence email that made its way to Tasha through one of her contacts. It read simply, "In light of recent findings, I am stepping away from the Juniper Hive board. I was unaware of the full scope of stakeholder history." There was no press conference, no public statement, just the slow crumbling of a carefully curated myth. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post. I didn't even speak of it beyond my small circle. The win, if it could be called that, wasn't sweet. It was clean, necessary, a correction, not a triumph. The old photo of Caleb on my wall remained. I didn't remove it, but I didn't look at it much either. The boy it captured was gone, long before the tech magazines ever found his name. Maybe that was part of the grief I'd been carrying. Not the man he became, but the child I once believed would never look through me to get where he was going. When Rena from Belmont called to formally acknowledge the validation of my majority stake, she ended the conversation with a quiet, almost awkward pause. "We appreciate your discretion," she said, "and your foresight." I hung up the phone, stared out at my tiny backyard, and thought, it wasn't foresight, it was survival. And I had learned, finally, that there is dignity in saying nothing until the receipts are ready. 6 weeks later, I walked through the front doors of Juniper Hive, not as a visitor, not as a mother in the shadows, but as the majority owner of the space. The co-working suite had been refurbished in my absence, all exposed beams and brass fixtures, the kind of modern Southern design Simone once called heritage chic. I kept most of it, stripped only what was necessary, the names on the glass, the marketing slogans about grit and legacy, written by people who never paid a late fee in their lives. The new name on the etched entry plaque read, "The Turner Collective." Beneath it, a single line, "A tech incubator for Black women over 50. Tasha stood beside me, holding the plaque before it was installed, her smile steady and proud. "He won't forget you now," she said, handing it over with a wink. I didn't laugh, but I let the warmth bloom quietly inside. She had been more than a paralegal. She had been a steward, a witness, a bridge between who I'd been and who I had become. Inside, the hum of possibility was already in motion. 2 of our inaugural fellows were touring the space. One, a former middle school science teacher, the other, a retired Delta flight attendant who had coded her own budgeting app during the pandemic. They reminded me of women I used to sit beside in beauty shops and church basements, bright, overlooked, powerful. Not waiting for seats at the table, but building new ones entirely. I didn't tell them my story. Not yet. They didn't need the drama. They needed the infrastructure. Wi-Fi that never dropped. Mentors who actually listened. Capital that didn't condescend. As I locked the glass doors that evening, sunlight pooled through the lobby, catching on the fresh logo like gold. My keys jingled in my palm. New ones, solid and simple. No child's name on the lease. No borrowed pride, just mine. I paused before leaving, pressing one hand to the wall beside the entrance, where the last trace of Caleb's branding had been painted over. No bitterness, just breath. I had become undeniable,